Okay, good morning. Good morning. Some new faces. Welcome, welcome. We are starting a new book. I know some of you, there's a chat. If you want to join the chat, you could speak to Lisa Freeman. That's Lisa. Hi, that's Lisa. She has the chat, and on that chat, you'll get updates. It's not like no one's going to, send tons of solicitations for random tzedakahs, etc., or memes or whatever. But basically just updates if there's any changes to the class, so feel free to reach out to Lisa. We are learning, we've been going through these different books over here called Surba Me'Rabanan. We're up to the 18th volume. You can find this on Amazon. It takes like 2 or 3 days to get delivered. And the unique element of this class, what I like about this class, and one of the reasons I started was the ability to have some level of text-based learning. Oftentimes when we learn Halacha, we're usually learning, oftentimes, Halacha especially, for whatever reason, is oftentimes, especially in female spaces, oftentimes taught, this is what you do, bottom line, bottom line, bottom line, bottom line. And what I was hoping to do, and hoping to do through this book, is give a little bit of context. We can't, to learn the quote-unquote sugya fully, to learn the topic fully, we'd have to spend like hours on end going through all the Gemaras. We're not going to do that. But what this book does is it kind of gives like a highlight of the Gemaras, and it takes us from the beginning, from the psukim in the Torah, through the Mishnayos, through the Gemaras, and ultimately making our way until the modern day authorities. And that is one of the unique, and I find, wonderful elements. Some people find it confusing. This isn't for everyone. But I think it having a little bit of context helps us understand the halachos much better. It's not just, okay, I do this. Why do I do that? Like, what's the rationale behind it? Where's the prohibition? What's it based on? That's the background over here. So, welcome. Here we go. So today we are going to be discussing bishul, cooking on Shabbos. We know that one of the 39 prohibitions is, one of the 39 things which are prohibited on Shabbos is to cook. Okay, there are 39 biblically prohibited activities on Shabbos. Just as my little soapbox, which I like getting on every once in a while, we talk about the laws of Shabbos, and that is muktzah is not one of the 39 prohibitions. Yeah, for whatever reason, in our education model, when you ask like a child or an adult, like what's prohibited on Shabbos? Muktzah. I tell my kids, you can't, separate this and that. They say, because it's muktzah. I said, no. Muktzah is d'Rabbanan. That's rabbinic. The separating, which we're going to get to, is biblical, right? So we are talking about the biblical prohibitions right now. These are the things which are found in the Torah, okay? And then later on, we're going to get into things like muktzah, which are still important, but they are rabbinic. Why am I saying that? Not to confuse you. I'm not really sure. It's just on my mind. But, okay, so the bottom line is bishul is one of the things that are prohibited on Shabbos. You cannot cook on Shabbos. If you want to go ahead and make yourself a soup on Shabbos, not allowed. You can't do it, okay? Now, typically, where do you cook? You cook on a fire. You turn on your elements, you put the food on the fire. Let's say you had the elements on before Shabbos, and you go ahead and make a soup. Of course, that's still prohibited, right? Even if you turn the fire on before Shabbos, that's its own prohibition, to start a fire on Shabbos. So let's say I started my fire on Shabbos, I had my oven on, and I want to go ahead and cook or bake on Shabbos, still prohibited. So again, if I go ahead and take some raw ingredients and put it in the oven on Shabbos, still prohibited, okay? Well, we're getting to that's ABC. We know we can't bake a cake. We can't make a soup from scratch on Shabbos. We all know that. Where it gets more complicated is, let's say you had something that was on a fire. Let's say you had your chicken soup that was on the fire before Shabbos, and it's fully cooked, a fully cooked chicken soup, okay? And then you go ahead and you take that chicken soup off the fire, okay? So now it's no longer on the fire, but the chicken soup, as you all know, is piping hot, right? What is the status of that pot, okay? So in halachic terminology, we call that a kli rishon. Literally like the first vessel or the first utensil. And what that means is that it's probably more accurately, it's the primary vessel. Kli is a utensil. Rishon means first. It means it's the primary vessel. This is the vessel you cooked in. So when you take the pot off of the fire, okay, so however, a fully cooked item, you take it off the fire, okay, the question's now going to be, am I allowed to add things to that primary utensil, which is no longer on the fire? That's the first question we're going to have to deal with, okay? Then we're going to deal with, what if I take the contents of that pot and now pour it into another utensil? So that second utensil is called a kli sheini, a secondary utensil, right? Does it also have the ability to cook? In other words, when something is still on the fire, let's say I have my chicken soup that's on the fire. It is a given, I cannot start adding peppers and salt or whatever to the item which is on the fire. That's for sure cooking. Okay? But if I take it off the fire, so it's no longer on a fire, but it's still hot, is that hot enough? Is that going to be cooking enough that it's going to be in violation of cooking on Shabbos while it's in the primary vessel off the fire? Is it going to be cooking enough when you pour the contents out to the second vessel, right? Is it going to be considered hot enough? Is it considered to be cooking enough that it's going to be cooking in the second vessel? And then I could go ahead and pour it into even another one, a kli shlishi. You're getting the hang of this. There's no kli revi or chamishi, but that is kli rishon, the primary utensil. You pour into the second one, kli sheini, kli shlishi. You pour into the third one, and I skipped something in the middle, and that is when I'm pouring from the primary utensil into the second utensil, right? So that pouring is called in Hebrew iroi. Iroi means to pour. And so as we'll see, there's some discussion about what happens if, let's say, I have like chicken soup. I have my chicken soup. I take it off the fire. It's in a kli rishon. And then I have then I have a bowl. I want to start pouring the soup into a bowl, okay? I don't have a ladle. I lost my ladle, okay? But I know that my soup is missing pepper. So I put some pepper on the bottom of each bowl, okay? And then I want to go ahead and pour into the bowl, okay? But I'm not pouring into the bowl and then adding pepper. I have pepper there first. So as I'm pouring it, it falls on that pepper. That is called iroi, pouring out from the first utensil. As we're going to see, and not to confuse you, don't worry, we'll have it simplified soon, but each of these different stages are going to have different halachos, there are different laws that pertain to each one of these stages, all right? The first utensil, kli rishon, pouring out of the first utensil, the iroi, pouring out of the first utensil, kli sheini, the secondary utensil, and kli shlishi, the third utensil. Each of them have different ramifications, and today we're going to learn some principles, and then next week, we're going to apply some of those principles into many practical questions that come up all the time in the kitchen, right? How many times have you taken the chicken soup off the fire or the chillin off the fire like, I forgot the fill in the blank, right? No, just our house? Fine. Right, we forget things. Zerv Shabbos, you're running around. I forgot the salt. I forgot the ketchup. I forgot this, right? I forgot to put the ketchup in the chillins or whatever spices you put in the chillins, right? I forgot, right? When are you allowed to add those things to your chillins? Are you allowed to add, soup nuts or matzo balls while the soup is still in the fire, right? All these different questions, very relevant, very practical. We're going to get into those halachos, but today, like all learning, we start with the principles, the foundation blocks, and then we'll go further, okay? So let's jump in. We'll see the first Gemara, really a Mishnah, and that is on page 23. Again, if you don't have one of these books, first of all, join the chat. You can speak to Lisa after the class. You can join the chat, and I'll put a link once again there. It's volume 18 of Tzur Memei Rabbanan. You can buy it on Amazon. You'll get it by next Sunday, okay? And if you do have one, and you're sitting next to someone who doesn't have one, please share. Okay. Ha'ilfis v'akadera. Okay, a pot and a stew pot. Okay, these are different types of pots. She'aviran musachin, that were taken off the fire, but they're boiling. They're very hot. Lo yitain l'sochan tavlin. You are not allowed to place spices into that primary pot. So the first halach, there's a Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us clearly, you had chicken soup, and you're like, whoops, I forgot to put the black pepper in, okay? And you take it off the fire. It's off the fire, okay? Still, you can't place pepper into that chicken pot, into that chicken soup pot, okay? However, aval nosein hu l'soch ha'ka'ara o l'soch ha'tamchoy. You are allowed to place those spices into the ka'ara is a bowl, tamchoy is another type of bowl, which means you are allowed to place your spices into the secondary bowl, right? In other words, the pot which comes off the fire, you can't place your peppers into that. That would be cooking. If you poured from the pot into a bowl, now that bowl is called a what? Kli sheini, secondary utensil, then I'm allowed to pour the pepper into there. Okay, so very simple. We have the Mishnah telling us clearly, if you forgot to put your pepper into your chicken soup, you're allowed, or your chillin, let's say, although chillin we'll see is going to be a little more complicated. Let's stick to chicken soup for now. And you go ahead and you take it off the fire. You still can't put your peppers in, right? Pepper in. But what you can do is you could start ladling it out into different bowls or pour it directly into those bowls. Now those bowls are kli sheini. You could then add a little bit of pepper before serving those bowls. Yes? Sarah?
So can you put the pepper in, must you put the pepper in the bowl first and then pour the soup?
No, opposite, as we'll see, opposite. First you pour it into the second bowl, and then you're going to put the pepper. And we'll see why soon. Yes?
So is a ladle considered...
I specifically was giving the weird example, trying to give the weird example of pouring directly from the pot, because the ladle is going to be its own discussion, which we'll come back to. Is that what you're going to ask as well? Okay, good. Okay, so here's the question now. Good. So again, we're getting your principles. Keep on asking the questions. I'm going to deflect some of them just so that we could get the principles. What's the difference between a kli rishon and a kli sheini? At the end of the day, if I stuck a thermometer into the pot, right? Okay, pot's on the fire. It's at, I don't know. What's it at? Anybody?
100 degrees.
How much?
100.
100 degrees. Probably hotter, right? Is that, yeah? I don't know. Whatever. Sorry, I have no idea. I don't know. You have a pot on the fire. It's boiling. Okay, it's at, I don't know.
212
212 degrees. That's the boiling point. Of course, I went to school. I forgot. Okay, fine. Yeah, 212 degrees. It's really hot. I take it off the thing. Let's say it's 200 degrees. Not boiling. It's just under boiling. I take it off the fire. A second later, it's what? It's at 199, maybe. Okay, and I pour it into the next bowl. What's it at? 195. Right? Is there really a difference, right? What's going on over here? Why is it that when it's in kli rishon, then that's cooking, right? It's kli sheini, I'm allowed to put things. What's going on, right? At the end of the day, they're both very hot, right? You with me on the question? There's a question that troubles. So the Mishnah says there is a difference. Kli rishon, yes. Kli rishon, no. Kli sheini, yes. Kli rishon, I cannot put my pepper in, but kli sheini, I'm allowed to put it in. What's the difference? What's the difference? This is the question that the Gemara, both the Talmud Bavli, which is the Babylonian Talmud, that's the classic Talmud that many of us learn, the Yushalmi, which is a previous version of the Talmud, which is a little bit harder to learn, not learned as by many. Both Gemaras ask this question. They're bothered. What's the difference between a Kli Rishon and a Kli Sheni? Says the Talmud Yerushalmi. Look at source number 2. The Talmud Yerushalmi says, we're on page 24. Ma ben Kli Rishon, ma ben Kli Sheni. What's the difference between the primary utensil and the secondary utensil? So we'll see two opinions. Amar Rav Yossi be Rabbi Bun. Rav Yossi, the son of Rabbi Bun, says, Kan hayad sholetas, v'kan ein hayad sholetas. In the primary vessel, your hand is able to hold onto it. In the secondary utensil, your hand is, in the primary utensil, excuse me, I said it wrong. In the primary utensil, your hand can't touch it. It's untouchable. In the secondary utensil, your hand is able to touch it. So what is he saying? What he's saying is that it's true. Maybe it's a similar temperature, but the temperature has gone down. By the time you go ahead, right, if you have something very hot and your pot's too hot, what do you do is quickly you put it into other things, and it becomes something which is touchable. It's something holdable. It's basically saying there's a decrease in the temperature by the time you go from utensil number 1 to utensil number 2, and that's why there is no halachic issue in adding the pepper into utensil number 2. Let's keep on reading for a second. That's opinion number 1, that there's a decrease in temperature. Amar Rabbi Yonah. Rabbi Yonah argues, he says, Kan v'kan ein hayad sholedas. He says, that's not true. I don't know, right? You put it in utensil number 1, and you pour that piping hot chicken soup into a secondary utensil. You're not touching that secondary utensil. Ein hayad sholedas, your hands can't touch it. Ela asu harchaka likli rishon, v'lo asu harchaka likli sheni. He says, our sages made a harchaka is like a distancing, like a safeguarding by a primary utensil. They didn't make a safeguarding for a secondary utensil. Now, I'm going to repeat the words, and we'll have to understand what he means. He says there really is no difference in terms of heat. They're both boiling hot, right? Don't touch. If you take your chicken soup off the fire and pour it into another pot, within a second or two, that pot is going to be piping hot as well. So what's the difference between them? He says, really, there is no fundamental difference, no real difference. It's just that the primary utensil, our sages made a decree about. The secondary utensil, our sages did not make a decree about. Okay, so what's he saying? What it sounds like he's saying is that even in the primary utensil, once it's off the fire, biblically, it's not cooking. Once it's off the fire, biblically, it's not really cooking. But what happens is that our sages said, if I'm going to allow you to put pepper into the primary utensil that's removed from the fire, I might mistakenly go ahead and put pepper in the primary utensil while it's on the fire. And therefore they said, don't put any spices, don't put any items into a primary utensil. But a secondary utensil, no one's going to get confused. That's already too distant from that first case, and therefore there's no problem. Right? In other words, you're following? Right? In other words, so the first opinion is saying, no, there's really a qualitative difference. The first utensil is really hot, and that's why it's cooking. The secondary utensil is not so hot. That's why it's not a problem. The other opinion is saying, really, both of them are really, from a biblical perspective, not an issue. It's more about optics. It's more about our sages being concerned about mixing things up, and therefore, once something's off a fire, biblically, it's not cooking. But the primary utensil is too similar to a primary utensil on the fire, and therefore, don't add anything to it. Whereas when you take it off the fire, when you pour it into a second utensil, you're not going to get confused. You with me? Right? What you see from here is, so let's read the Ramban. The Ramban is one of the medieval commentators. Now we're jumping, so we just went just to follow the on a time machine over here. Basically, we started the Mishnah. The Mishnah was written like the years 200 or so, and then we jumped to the Talmud Yerushalmi, which was written about 100 or so years later, 150 years later, and now we're jumping about 700 years, 800 years to the time of the medieval commentators, to the Ramban, one of the commentators on the Gemara. Okay, and so we're basically the way Torah works is it's layers. It starts with verses, Mishnayos, Gemaras, and then the medieval commentators, then the later commentators are all like like building on one another. So now we're at the further layers, the Rishonim, what is known as the Rishonim, the medieval commentators, the Ramban Nachmanides. He says like this, Rav Yitzchak bar Gufna, we're at source number 3. Rav Yitzchak bar Gufna Bai, he asked the following, Rav Yitzchak, the son of Gufna, asked the following question. Bikli Rishon Nami, in a primary utensil, alphys vikadera, which is different types of pots, she'avira merusachin demasnisan, that you took them off, that they were still boiling, as it's mentioned in our Mishnah. Im avar va'asakain chayav hu shumevashel olo. So let's say a person goes ahead and adds pepper to the primary utensil which was taken off the fire. Okay? And let's say the Beis HaMikdash was still standing. Okay? If the Beis HaMikdash is still standing and a person violates Shabbos by mistake, what do they have to do? You have to bring a korban. Now that's only if you violate a biblical prohibition. For example, in other words, if I go ahead and I violate the laws of muktzah, it's a prohibition, I did something wrong, I would not bring a korban because that is dirabanan. If I went ahead and cooked on Shabbos by mistake, I woke up in the morning, I forgot it's Shabbos, I was jet lagged, and so I forgot it was Shabbos. I woke up the other day after taking a nap, I had no idea where I was, what time it was, I was so confused, okay? So yeah, if I wake up and I'm like, I'm going to make myself some food, and I make some macaroni in the fire, right? So if I do so on the fire, make macaroni on Shabbos, I'd have to bring, by mistake, I'd have to bring a korban chatas. Let's say I took a pot of soup off the fire, okay, or a pot of hot water off a fire, okay, and while it's off the fire, I put some macaroni into it, okay, some raw macaroni into it. Do you have to bring a chatas or not? Biblical or not?
No.
Why not? Depends you. What? Sorry.
Because it's off the fire. You said you put it in.
I took it off the fire, right? How do you know? So how do you know it's not biblical? You're right. It's not on the fire.
Because cooking is al ha'esh. I mean, you're asking where it's coming from.
Oh, so I'm asking. Sorry. Okay. So you're not wrong. You're not wrong. But we'll see. It's actually a debate. It's actually a debate. So if you recall, in the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud just told us like this. Let's go back to the Jerusalem Talmud, right? It said, there's two opinions. One opinion said, the second opinion said, once you take something off the fire, it's not cooking, like you said, right? What's the difference between primary vessel and secondary vessel? Primary vessel, you might get confused with it being on the fire, but really, primary vessel off the fire, it's not really cooking, like Karen said, right? So it's not visual. So according to that opinion, the second opinion, it would not be cooking whatsoever. You would not bring a korban chatas. The first opinion said no. The difference between primary and secondary is not that, the difference between primary and secondary is that it's just that the primary is really hot and therefore it's cooking. The secondary, it's less hot, okay? It's cooler and therefore it's not cooking. So the Ramban is
You'd be chayav?
You'd be chayav chatas. Yeah. You'd be chayav chatas. Says the Ramban, upashale, and by the answer, right after the question mark, upashale shu pater aval aser, shein bishul barer ela ba'or mahalach tachtav, okay, so first he answers that you're exempt, but it's prohibited. Okay, because there's no cooking when it's off the fire. Okay, and that's what the Yerushalmi, again, according to one answer, says. Amar Rav Yonah, kan v'kan eina yalat shelet. According to the second answer, both cases it's not hot enough. They made a distinction between, they made a decree by the Kli Rishon, they didn't do so by Kli Sheini. We see, at least according to that opinion, the second opinion, that it is just harchaka, it's a rabbinic prohibition against cooking even in a primary vessel that's off the fire. So the Ramban basically is ruling like the second opinion, which is saying that in both cases it's rabbinic. Just that first primary vessel, you're going to get confused with it being on the fire. Secondary vessel, you won't get confused. Like you said, Karen, according to that second opinion, it's going to be rabbinic. If I add macaroni, raw macaroni, to boiling water off the fire, rabbinic.
But this is only in the Yerushalmi. It's not in Bavli.
Correct. We're going to get back. So correct. The Bavli doesn't. See, the problem is like this. The Bavli does not address this directly. It's only going to be medieval commentators commenting on the Bavli. So the most primary sources that talk about it are the Yerushalmi. If you look at the next source number 4, we're just going to jump to the ends of the comments, and that is this is the Rashba. The Rashba is also one of the medieval commentators. So source number 4. Now going to jump to the top of page 25 by the bold words. See the bold words? Okay. V'amevashel ba. He's referring to a Kli Rishon off of a fire. Chayav chatas. You are going to be liable for bringing a korban chatas. Kimevashel ala eish mamish. Just like you are cooking on the fire. The Rashba is disagreeing with the Ramban. He says the primary pot taken off of the fire, right? And I go ahead and I put raw macaroni into that pot. He says if I were to do so by mistake on Shabbos, I would have to bring a korban chatas. Which opinion in the Yerushalmi is he going like? Rav Yossi, right? Rav Yossi ben Rav Bun, who basically says, primary pot, even off the fire, it's full-fledged cooking. Okay, so we have a debate over here. When everyone agrees, I take a pot off the fire, I cannot add items to it. Okay? The question is doing so biblically prohibited or rabbinically prohibited? The Ramban says, like the second opinion, it's rabbinically prohibited. Really, it's not cooking, it's rabbinically prohibited. The Rashba, okay, the Rashba says that this is biblically prohibited, but bottom line is they both agree it is prohibited. So practically speaking, it doesn't make too much of a difference, but we see how those two opinions in the Yerushalmi are expressed differently. One opinion takes, one of the medieval commentators, the Ramban, takes the second opinion, the Rashba takes the first opinion. Okay, yes?
It's sort of like when we hear things, it's like the fence around the fence.
So, correct. So right now we're still talking about primary fences. We're going to get to secondary fences, which is always a question. Typically, our sages make one fence. They don't make two fences. When they do, we have to question it. Yeah.
Right. So, like the fence will protect the first primary.
Exactly.
So this is protecting the primary just in case.
Correct. In case someone's going to go and confuse it. Right. So that's the question. The primary vessel off of the fire. Is it that it's actually cooking? It's not a fence. It's actually the Isra D'Oraisa. It's a biblical prohibition. Or according to the other opinion, the Ramban, he says, no, it's a fence because we're going to confuse it with an item on the fire. That's exactly it. Says that, yes.
So, I'm not learning Gemara myself. Does this happen often where there are two opinions and there's no conclusion? In other words, and
there are. I mean, when you say conclusion, you mean what do you mean?
Gemara? I mean, in other words, now it's left.
Yes, all the time. Yeah.
So then. Well, I guess we're gonna get to the later commentators.
Yes. I'm gonna make a book recommendation. I was hoping to have a guest speaker over Shavuos. His name is Rabbi Dr. Chaim Seiman. He's a law professor in Villanova who wrote a book called Halacha. Nice and easy title to remember, and he explains like Gemara, because Gemara is kind of weird and kind of confusing. And he explains like how to understand Gemara. And I thought, especially this year, many of us have been, many people have been new to learning Daf Yomi, etc. I was hoping to bring him here for Shavuos. He's a family man. He said it's between semesters, whatever. He can't. It's too hard for him to get away for a whole Shavuos. He wants to be with his family. Kol hakavod. Okay, hopefully we'll have him at some points, but in the meantime, I'd recommend his book, and I think it'll address many of these questions. Like the Gemara, Gemara is a little confusing. Go read that book. It's great. Okay.
What's his name?
His name is Seiman, Saiman, Chaim Seiman. Okay. Let's see how the Shulchan Aruch rules. Says the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch again is written by Rav Yosef Karo. This comes after the medieval commentators. He's writing 500 years ago or so on page 25, source 5, Kli Rishon. Okay, a prime utensil. Perish, meaning hakli shemishtamesh bo al ha'esh, the utensil that was used on the fire. Afil la'achar sheviruhu me'al ha'esh, even after it's taken off the fire. Mivashel, it cooks. Okay, now he's not weighing in if it's biblical or rabbinic. It doesn't matter. For all intents and purposes, you can't. You're saying it sounds like he's saying it's biblical. It could be. I'm not sure. I'm not confident. But we'll come back to that question. Fair. So it sounds like. So bottom line is, he's saying that you cannot put items into a primary utensil taken off of the fire. Kolzman. Here's key words. Kolzman shayad soletisbo. As long as it's yad soletisbo, literally means that your hand touches it and recoils. Meaning it's very hot. Touches the utensil. Okay? Lefikach aser litin l'tocho tavlin. Therefore, you cannot place uncooked spices into this pot. And says the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah is the individual who wrote the Mishnah Berurah is the same person known as the Chafetz Chaim. He writes a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, and he writes shayad soletis bo avalim ein hayad soletis bo. If it cooled off, if it's no longer really hot, afilu kli rishon in a mevashel, then a primary utensil is not considered cooking. Okay, so here's the bookend of this law. I take something off a fire, it's very hot, I can't put pepper into it or whatever. Okay, but I leave it there for an hour and a half. Okay, and now your soup it's warm, it's ready you can serve it to the kids. Okay, it's warm, and I want to add some pepper to that, no problem, right? It's only a problem when it's still very hot. But once it goes down in temperature, that it's no longer piping hot, it's just warm, you could go ahead and add spices even to the primary utensil. Good? Okay? Now again, we're going to get many more halachic, practical ramifications, but just for starters, we'll see one practical, simple application. If you look in the bottom of page 25, source 7, this is from a wonderful book called The Shabbos Kitchen. He writes, if a kli rishon, again, the primary utensil, contains hot food or liquids, okay, if the primary utensil contains anything hot in it, it is forbidden to immerse in it any uncooked item. Right? If there is, in a primary utensil, there are hot foods or liquids, you can't add any uncooked items. For example, one may not add seasoning to a pot of hot soup, even after the pot has been removed from the blech, because the heat, now on page 26, because the heat of the soup will cook the seasoning. Cold water may also not be added in small amounts to a pot of hot water or soup. Right? There's another very important example. Let's say you have little children, right? So my children, whenever they have soup, we give them we put ice cubes into the thing, right? So let's say I was cooking a small bowl of soup it was on the blech before Shabbos, okay? It was just for the children to eat before Shabbos, whatever it was, okay? Before I come home from whatever, a small pot that's just for the kids, and I take it off the fire, right? And I want to cool it off, so I add an ice cube to it. Can't do it. I just cooked. Because I added it to a piping hot pot, primary pot, adding an ice cube, adding some cold water, it's going to go ahead and make that ice cube, I'm going to make it hot, right? So I'm cooking the ice cube. I can't do it, okay? In small amounts. We'll come back to large amounts later on, to a pot of hot water or soup. Since the cold water will become heated by the hot water of the kli rishon, similarly, cooled liquids which have cooled may not be added to kli rishon, since it is forbidden to reheat liquids that have cooled completely, as we learned above, okay? So adding anything uncooked, and included in uncooked and raw, are liquids that cool off, okay? So we spoke about this a while back. But in addition, so we've been talking about like adding pepper, like uncooked raw pepper. But let's say I want to add water, or let's say I even have something like let's say I have hot water and I have tea essence. Okay, tea essence. So tea essence is something which was cooked, right? It's cooked, and then now it's cooled off. It's been sitting on my counter. It's cold, right? So in a kli rishon, it's cooled off water. If I add it to the kli rishon, the primary utensil, then even though it was something which was preheated, it was pre-cooked, but now I'm heating it up again. If I take a cold liquid and I make it hot, it's as if I just cooked it. So I wouldn't even be allowed to add the tea essence to the primary utensil. Secondary utensil, no problem. But the primary utensil, I took out the fire. So again, I had hot water on my blech, okay, on the plata. I take the kettle of hot water off, and now I want to add tea essence into it, cold tea essence. I can't do so because it's going to be taking that cold tea essence and making it hot, which cannot be done on Shabbos. Bottom line is, if you want to take a simple takeaway, don't put anything in your primary utensil. Without all the complications, that's your bottom line. Don't put anything in the primary. We'll see there are some exceptions, but bottom line is don't put anything in the primary utensil on Shabbos. It basically cooks. Yes? Hi.
Okay, say you have chicken soup, you take your ladle, put it into the bowl, and it's very hot. Can you put an ice cube in that bowl?
Absolutely. And we're going to get, now we're going to talk about a sheini, which we're going to get into right now. Sheini is when I've taken, and forget the ladle. Let's ignore the ladle because the ladle is going to confuse us all.
Is the ladle a sheini?
Come back, to be continued. Okay, We'll see. Okay, so bottom line is a sheini is going to be, a ladle's a little complicated. So for all intents and purposes, we're going to pretend, that I'm around and I'm too lazy to get the ladle because I have to clean it later. So I'm taking it from the primary pot and pouring it into the little bowl, probably making a mess. So we're just going from primary utensil into secondary utensil. We're skipping the ladle for now. We will get there. Yes.
You'll probably come back to it, but coffee.
Let's come back to it. Okay, let's come back to it. We're gonna get to let's hold off. We want to get to the principles because these are good questions. They're all have certain complications and it's a little confusing. And I really want to make sure we get the principles down. Bottom line is kli rishon, anything in a primary utensil will be considered cooking. Biblically, rabbinically, doesn't matter. Don't put things into a kli rishon. Okay, don't put things in a primary utensil as long as it's hot. Once it cools off a little, you can start adding things to it. Okay, now we're gonna get into a kli sheini. Okay. Says Tosfos. Okay, now this Tosfos is going to be, I don't know why they organized it this way. It really should have been mentioned in the piece before, but let's see. Says Tosfos. Tosfos is one of the medieval commentators. He's found on the page of the Talmud. It's a really collection of people, and they're known as the Tosafos, okay? Literally from the word add it. They're like add on their commentary to Rashi's commentary, and that's why they're called Tosafos. They are being, most if they add on, many of them are descendants of Rashi. Okay, so they said this. So Shva mina kli sheini ena mavashel. The Gemara has a statement which says explicitly that a kli sheini, a secondary utensil, does not cook. Okay, and now they ask the same question that we saw already in the Yerushalmi, and they give an answer which might be aligned with one of them, but let's see what they say. Tema, it doesn't make sense, or it's astonishing. Maishna kli sheini mi kli rishon. What's the difference between a secondary utensil and a primary utensil? Di'i yad soledes afilu kli sheini nami. If you want to tell me that we're talking about piping hot liquids, then when it goes into kli sheini, it's still piping hot. Maybe it went down a little, whatever, it's still piping hot. The ein yad soledes afilu kli rishon nami ein mavashel. And if you want to tell me it's not piping hot, then the substance found in the kli rishon is also not cooking, like we just saw. So this is how they answer it. V'yesh lomar, you could say like this: Lefli shekli rishon, a primary utensil, mitoch sha'amad ala or, because it sat on the fire, dofnosav chamin, the walls of the utensil are very hot. right? When you put a pot on the fire, the fire doesn't magically just get to the food. It heats up the pot, and by heating up the pot, it also is going to heat up the substance there, okay? Umachzik chomos man meruba. And because of that, it is going to retain the heat for a long time. It's not just the food, which is going to take, food in a vacuum is going to take a certain amount of time to cool off. But the food with the walls of this utensil are going to take longer to cool off because the walls of the utensil, which are also boiling hot, are going to maintain the heat. Ulekach nasnu bo shir, and therefore our sages came along and gave a measurement. It calls man sheyatzu lettuce bo aser. As long as it's boiling hot, it's going to be forbidden, because not only because the food is hot, but because the walls are retaining the heat, so it's very hot. Aval kli sheini, but with the secondary utensil, afa gav de yatzu lettuce bo, even if it's boiling hot, mutter, it is permitted. She'ein dofnos of chamin, because the walls are not so hot, the holech umiskarer, and it is continuously cooling off. So basically, the way Tosfos understands the difference between a kli rishon and kli sheini is not about the heat of the liquid itself, but the point is that in one place, in the primary utensil, the food is staying and maintaining its heat for a while. In the secondary utensil, the walls of the secondary bowl, they came out of your cupboard, they came out of the closet, whatever it is, and there the walls themselves are not hot because they weren't on the fire, and therefore, even though right now it's very hot, it's continuously cooling because the walls are going to cool it off, right? I believe if you were to go ahead and if you had some boiling hot chicken soup, you want to figure out where you should take the chicken, and it's too hot, but you want to take some, where's the coolest place in the bowl? I believe along the sides, right? Because the sides are coming into contact with something which is not piping hot.
When you do kids, take your spoon and take it from the side of the bowl.
Correct. Okay, and that's basically the basic principle. I think after a few seconds or whatever, it might change, but immediately, at least, the point is that the walls are coolest, and that's this principle. The principle is that the walls of the utensil are cool, and that's why kli sheini, a secondary utensil, is qualitatively different than a kli rishon. That's how Tosfos addresses the question. Yes?
Wouldn't it depend on the material that the kli sheini is made of, though? Because some of them are going to get hot, like metal is going to get hot very fast.
Yes, it will depend, and it sounds like, and there's a big debate about what exactly he's saying. There certainly will make a difference, but everyone will agree that there is a qualitative difference between the primary utensils heat and the secondary utensils heat, even though you're right, a thick plastic utensil will take a while, whatever, or like a thin sheet of metal is going to get hot very quickly. Some other materials will take a while to get hot. But it almost sounds like he's saying he's in the camp of rabbinic prohibitions, and he's saying that, therefore, since by definition it's cooling off in one and it's maintaining heat in the other, that's like a clean distinction they're making, even though from a pure, you could debate if it's coming from a plastic kli rishon to a metal kli sheini. Bottom line is that there's a logical distinction between the two. Yes?
As the walls get hot, they're actually taking heat from the food itself. So even if they're heating up, that's taking heat from the food.
And therefore what? And therefore you're saying...
Therefore cooling down the food.
As if you're heating up the walls, you're by definition reducing the
Okay. Now I feel. Thank you. Okay, yes.
I know when my kids were little, well, it depends on when you're going out and you have a thermos and you want to put hot water or hot coffee or soup or whatever. I always put hot water in it first, warm it, and then spill it out and then put it in so it keeps whatever I put in hotter longer.
Right. Excellent.
And, also with kids, when it's like you make hot chocolate or whatever, I always take the cup and pour it in another cup to cool it off.
Right.
A couple times.
Good. So you are in court. You are like the Gemara is just like running through your veins. Like that's okay. Yeah. No. That's exactly it. Yeah, those are the principles we're seeing over here. Kli sheini cools it off. Yes.
The technical term would be heat transfer.
The technical term for what? For
the idea of the kli sheini being cooler.
The heat transfer.
The heat is not transferring from the vessel to the food, but rather now from the food to the vessel.
Fantastic. Okay. This is great. Thank you all for teaching me. Okay, this is good. This is very good. Okay, so here's the question. So far we've learned. Now I pour, so we've seen very clearly, I pour from the primary utensil into the kli sheini, right? So I took it from the pot that came off the fire into the bowl. Now I can add my pepper. Now I can add my water. We'll see. We're going to get into more details, but this is the basic principles. Kli sheini, generally speaking, is not mevashel. Now we're going to see a couple of caveats to this. One thing, if the principle, like Tosfos said, is that in a kli sheini, the walls are cooling it off, okay? So there should be an exception to this rule, because a liquid you're going to pour a liquid in, by definition, it's going to reach the walls. It's going to be surrounded by the walls, wall 1, wall 2, wall 3, the sides around it, and the bottom. But let's say you place a solid item in a kli sheini, right? There, it's going to just take my steak out of our chicken off primary thing number one, and I dump it into a plate, right? So there, it's not touching all the walls. So the heat transfer, is that the word? Heat transfer, right, is going to be limited, right? It's going to be limited in the sense that it's only transferring to one surface, right? It's not surrounded by three surface or whatever, by all around it except for the top. It's not surrounded on all sides. The heat transfer is more limited because it's only touching one thing. Maybe it's touching
I don't think it's as hot to begin with.
A solid?
Yeah.
Could be. We'll see. There's going to be some discussion, but let's see. So what we're going to do right now is jump into the laws of milk and meat. Okay, we're going to jump into the laws of milk and meat, and then we're going to try to bring those laws back. We're going to try to bring those laws back to cooking on Shabbos. Okay, so let's see. So the first source is from Isser V'Heter, known as Isser V'Heter. Okay, he writes like this: Basar Roseach, source number 9 on page 28. Hot meat, sheyad soledes bo, which you touch, it's boiling. Shenechtach b'sakin shel chalav, shuhu ben yomo, which was cut with a dairy knife that was used that day. Mitashmesh roseach, it was used with dairy that day with something very hot. O b'sakin shel shar isurin, or a knife that was used for, I don't know, pork or whatever. Agav duchka desakina bolea bekulo, because of the intensity of the knife. Okay, it's going to absorb in its entirety. Okay, so we're not going to review all the laws of milk and meat right now, but the bottom line is, let's say I used a milchig knife earlier in the day to cut hot cheese. I don't know, whatever, fine. I was using cut hot cheese. And then I go ahead and I take that same knife later in the day, I got confused, and I take that same knife and I start cutting my steak with it. Now my steak is on my plate. It's not on the fire, it's on my plate. Okay? The halacha is that the dairy, again, it's ben yomo, it's dairy that I used that day for hot items, then that whole meat is considered basar b'chalav. It's considered milk and meat, and I have to throw away the whole steak. Okay? V'lo dami li kli sheini, v'davar yavish, and it's not similar to a regular kli. When you have a davar yavish, a dry item, a non-liquid item, it is not like a regular kli sheini. Why? Because leka defanos hamekaros, it doesn't have the walls that are cooling it off. It only has the bottom of the surface. It doesn't have the walls. Umevasha mia kozman sheyad soledes bo, and therefore that steak is going to retain enough heat until it cools off, and it's going to be considered as if it's still in the kli rishon. In other words, they're saying that there's not enough of a heat transfer when it goes into utensil number 2, when it's dry, because it's not surrounded by the walls, only the bottom, and therefore it maintains its heat until it cools off, and therefore, since it's hot, again, he's talking about laws of meat and milk, but if you go ahead and you cut it with a dairy ben yomo knife, it's going to make the whole thing basar b'chalav, it's going to transfer one to the other. Typically, when it comes to laws of milk and meat, if I went ahead and I, let's say I had a coffee, and it was in a kli sheini, okay? And so I had my coffee, there's milk, and it's a kli sheini. Let's say it's still piping hot, but it's a kli sheini, and I took a fleshig spoon, which I just used for chicken soup earlier, or meat, and then I go on and mix it, you're not going to have an issue. Okay, you still have to kasher the spoon, but the milk chocolate milk, the coffee you can still drink. Why? Because the kli sheini. But here we're saying the steak, even though it's in a kli sheini, it doesn't have the halacha of a kli sheini, because the fact that it's a dry matter, a dry item, and therefore it's going to maintain its status as if it's in the kli rishon and be a full-fledged cooking. Okay, be full-fledged cooking. Okay, let's see. Let's go a little bit further.
If you have to kasher the spoon.
Sorry.
If you have to kasher the spoon, then how come?
We're not. It's a longer discussion, but there are going to be many scenarios where you have to kasher something, and the food itself is totally fine. Do me a favor. I think the one takeaway I think we had laws of basar b'chalav is like, don't throw any food away. Many times the food, anything's not a ben yomo. Very briefly, but anything's not a ben yomo. I'll get to this too briefly.
You're saying if you use that spoon for fleshik that day.
No. If it's in a kli sheini, but in a kli sheini because it's not cooking in a kli sheini. It's not hot enough. Yeah. Okay. I promise I'm not a heretic. Okay, let's go. Fine. So let's go a little further. Okay, fine. So let's just jump to source 11 because we're running a little bit low on time. Source 11. This is the Darchei Moshe. This is Darchei Moshe is a commentary written by Ramosha Isserlis. Ramosha Isserlis is known as the Ramah. He wrote his most famous commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, but he wrote an earlier book called Darchei Moshe, which he wrote as a commentary on something called the Torah. Okay, and so this is here he's writing. He says like this. This is Darchei Moshe. Aval mikvar munach b'kli sheini cham. If something is already in a kli sheini, afal pisha yad soledes bo, even if it is boiling hot, eino mavliya kimo shar kli sheini. It is not going to absorb like all other kli shenis. O davar av kigon chatichas basar shenicha b'kli sheini. This will be true as well for a thick food, like a piece of meat. Delo gara davar shu gush mi davar lach. A dry item is no worse than a liquid. So the Darchei Moshe is arguing with the opinion we just saw. He said, no, whether it's liquid or it's solid, Kli Sheini is a Kli Sheini. There's going to be enough heat transfer when it gets into the Kli Sheini, and therefore it's not cooking. Okay, V'chein mashma d'vei Rashba. Okay, and he says like this, and this is, who made this point? I think Yael made this point. Gam shenir le'nayim, Karen made, someone made this point. Gam shenir le'nayim, it's even you could see with your eyes. Sherotiv roseches yoser, liquid boils more, and therefore shomeres chomo, and therefore maintains its heat more midavar av, a dry item. Okay, he argues that in truth a liquid actually maintains its heat better than a solid. Okay, so there's like a scientific debate over here. Which one maintains its heat better? Okay, they didn't measure it, they couldn't measure it, whatever. Bottom line is, they're arguing, the first opinion says, a liquid to a Kli Sheini, once it's in the Kli Sheini secondary utensil, not cooking at all. But a solid, it doesn't have the walls, and therefore maintains its heat. It's as if it's still in the primary vessel. The Ramas is the opposite. He says, first of all, a liquid maintains its heat better than a solid. Second of all, he says there's really no difference. Halacha, and their bottom line, he says no difference halachically. Just like a liquid going into Kli Sheini loses its status of being a Kli Rishon, and now is a Kli Sheini, so too a solid. That is the opinion of the Darchei Moshe. Okay, so one opinion says you have to distinguish between a liquid and a solid. One opinion says you do not. Now, remember, what are they talking about? They're not talking about Shabbos. They're talking about the laws of kosher. Now, the laws of kosher, there is an opinion, which again, we're not going to have the time to see inside. Let's just see the bold words in source 13. In source 13, you see the bold words in source 13. This is the Chavas Das. He writes like this, the bold words. Aval shar dvarim chamin, af sheyesh lehem din. I'm just going to summarize. I'm sorry. I'm just going to summarize. And that is this. He says that when it comes to, the criteria for transferring milk to meat, meat to milk, or forbidden items into permitted items is a lower threshold than what's needed for the laws of Shabbos. For the laws of Shabbos, we're looking for what is halachically considered cooking. Okay? That, the threshold is much higher. And therefore he says, even if we go with the more stringent opinion that says a davar gush, a dry item, is able to cook, maybe that's only by the laws of transferring meat to milk. But when it comes to Shabbos, maybe even that opinion would agree that a solid item on a Kli Sheini is not going to cook. Right? You see, in other words, we can't so easily jump from the laws of milk and meat to the laws of Shabbos. Maybe the criteria for transferring meat and milk, in other words, I have hot milk and I have hot steak, and they're touching each other. Maybe that's enough of a transfer to cause flavor to get into one another. But if you want to tell me, am I cooking on Shabbos? Cooking is much higher threshold. And therefore he says, even if it's true that a davar gush, a solid item, is considered a Kli Rishon, even in a Kli Sheini, it's considered like it's in a primary utensil, even when I put it in a secondary utensil, maybe that's only by basar b'chalav, by laws of kosher. But the laws of cooking, maybe there we should be more lenient. So basically we have three different opinions. We have those who say that when it comes to a solid item, whether we're talking about the laws of milk and meat, or whether we're talking about the laws of Shabbos, a Kli Sheini is just like a Kli Rishon. Your steak, you can't add pepper to your steak in a Kli Sheini when it's really hot. That's opinion number one. We have opinion number two, which is the Darchei Moshe, says no. Once it's in a Kli Sheini, whether it's a liquid, whether it's a solid, it's all the same. And therefore I could add pepper. And then you have opinion number three, who says it depends. When it comes to laws of meat and milk, it's like it's in the Kli Rishon. And therefore if I had a steak and it touched a piece of cheese, right, then it would cause the entire thing to be treif. Okay? But in the laws of Shabbos, we would be more lenient, because laws of Shabbos you have to be cooking. Cooking is cooking. And therefore, in a Kli Sheini, a solid item, you'd have to be, it would not be enough to be cooking. Okay? So those are the three opinions. One saying a solid item is cooking, one solid item is not cooking, one saying depends. By milk and meat, it's cooking. By laws of kosher, by laws of Shabbos, it's not cooking. Let's just read one more thing and then I'll take a question. How do we rule? So if you look at source 15, page 30, source 15, the minhag, and by minhag means the Ashkenazic minhag, is to be machmir, to adopt a stringent attitude and to treat a davar gush with all of the restrictions of a Kli Rishon for most practical purposes. Okay, so this is the common accepted norm, is that a solid item that went from a primary utensil, you took your chicken off your pan, and you put it onto your plate. As long as it's still hot, we treat it as if it's in the primary utensil, and therefore, one may not sprinkle diced onion, garlic, celery, or any previously uncooked spices and seasoning directly onto a hot davar gush, just as one may not put these items into a Kli Rishon. So the normative Ashkenazi custom is to treat chicken in a secondary utensil as if it's in a primary one, and therefore you can't put any raw items onto your chicken. I apologize. I have to run somewhere today, so we're gonna stop over here. Usually we're trying to get a little close to 9:30. But bottom line is we've learned the laws of kli rishon. Don't put anything in kli rishon. Certainly nothing raw in kli rishon. Kli sheini we saw is not problematic. What we got into is a solid item from a kli sheini. Is that like a kli rishon, kli sheini? That's a debate. We typically go with the more stringent view. We'll see some caveats to this more stringent view, and we still have not got it into Eroy to pouring. So God willing, next week we're going to finish the last principle, or last two principles, and then we're going to talk about a number of practical applications. Have a wonderful day. Okay.